Thank you very much, Michael. And it's good to be back here again on this eternal topic of what has or is likely to happen in the Irish political scene. This year, the inimitable Joe Holland is challenging us with an extraordinarily difficult question, which is to try and make some sense out of what is happening currently in Irish politics and what is likely to happen in the very, very near future now anyway, as we're facing into an election. So I was drawn to speak first, so I don't have the benefit of hearing what my illustrious and extraordinarily distinguished and experienced fellow speakers will have to say. So, however, I'm going to start with a quote from somebody who is equally august as Joe is, the naturalist philosopher George Santayana. His words are inscribed over a flying sculpture which is set against a vast array of monuments and headstones outside or in the concentration camp at Dachau. And the words that are inscribed above this sculpture for all of our benefit are, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So it's in that context I'm going to try and address this particular question. One of the greatest indicators of the future and our ability to influence it is our knowledge of the past. So if we want to know what we're likely to do in the future, you start by, it's not a predetermined, you start by looking at what we have done in the past. And this is particularly so when there is a sense now that we're almost living in a continuous present, that we and our experience are the total equation and not just a term in time. But you will all have remembered that Philae Lander would never have come back to life with a tweet from that comet. And even this week, we wouldn't have got a look at Pluto without Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin taking man's first step on the moon on this very night in 1969. So yes, we are emerging now from a severe recession, as the chairman pointedly referenced, not everywhere and not equally. But certainly not either for the first time in our history. And when faced with circumstances similar in the past, how did we react? What did we do? And how did we do? Well, let's take a brief look at that and then ask, are things different now? And perhaps see if we can draw some tentative conclusions. At best, at this point, tentative. Our state will soon be 100 years old. And perhaps we'll collectively get some kind of a check from our president. And the state got off to a solid enough start. It was a very difficult times, conservative economically and politically, as was the orthodoxy of the day, made significant progress in setting up a functioning democracy, and even brought a spirited, even adventurous approach to economic development, as shown by the start of rural electrification and the Totemic Ardna Crusher project. The politics of the state, though, then were austere, dominated by civil war issues, and like other countries, our infant state was buffeted by the international recession triggered by the Wall Street crisis in the late 1920s. But the state also saw a government taking steps that they saw necessary to limit the damage of that crisis and to control the situation, without indeed much regard for themselves and the inevitable political fallout of the actions they took, some would say showing a degree of political naivety even for that time. And the inevitable occurred, and during the 30s a more popular form of politics began to emerge. There were a huge set of issues around the Anglo-Irish Treaty, including, older people here will remember, or those who still study a bit of history, the ports issue and the land annuities payments question. And on the social side, there was a growth in issues around the relief of poverty and helping the unemployed. And there was a new government which was well to the left of its predecessor. And a government which indeed had more an eye for what the voter liked than its predecessor, and perhaps, and that would be less on what needed to be done. But that is a value judgment, and people can have different views on that. But the actions of the Irish government at that stage on land annuity payments, which, as you remember, were not paid to the British government, which had put up the money to buy the land in the first place, but was taken by the Irish government, paid to themselves, led to a huge conflict between Ireland and Britain. And that, combined with the general rhetoric of the time, led to the economic war in the 1930s. And that war intensified the isolationism that had characterized Ireland during the 30s and 40s, and itself derived, in a way, from the thinking of the early Sinn Féin and Arthur Griffith, what the name came from, Sinn Féin, ourselves alone, or whatever other version you would put on it. The Second World War then copper-fastened that reality, reinforced the policy of supporting often inefficient native businesses while imposing tariffs on imports, thus effectively pricing them out of the market when in competition with local products. For its part, the population at large accepted what was a harsh and frugal existence with remarkable stoicism and, for periods, minimal expectations. It was seen, certainly in many ways, as our lot in life. We were assured by our leaders, political and clerical, very importantly, that a better fate awaited us in the next life. Provided, of course, that we behaved ourselves and did what we were told in this life. And if God was for us, who could be against us? And anyway, who were we to demur from what our leaders told us? It was a strange time in Ireland. Until the late 40s then, there was nothing like a revolution in the streets or in the ballot box. In 1948, the voters rebelled to a certain extent. They put the De Valera's government out of power after 18 years, and after 16 years, but they failed to settle on any alternative model of government. The 1950s were a boom time in the Western world, with post-war reconstruction everywhere. American aid through the Marshall Plan, so on, flooding the continent with capital into the various countries. But Ireland, still in the grip of protectionism, we scarcely noticed that this was happening, except for the mass emigration of our people to build the infrastructure and industry of others. Our boats and sometimes our planes were busy, but not much else, as many young men and women said goodbye in that period. And in their absence, however, political life was volatile. Governments changed in 48 and in 51 and in 54 and in 47. 4 changes of government in 9 years. And that was a new experience at that time. And there are some similarities between 48 and now. For example, a proliferation of parties and numbers of prominent independents. But it was in the 60s then Ireland experienced its first hint of growth and prosperity in the modern sense. We did the Hucklebuck, and we undid, albeit belatedly, protectionism, starting with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement in the early 60s, and conclusively when we joined the European Economic Community in 1972. Tax-free exports were embraced, and welcome was given to inward investment, and that began to change the self-image and the expectations of most people, strengthened further by the universal secondary education, which arrived, better health services and better housing conditions generally for the population. By the early 70s, Ireland seemed set for long-term growth, better working conditions and better living conditions. We were enthusiastic members of the EEC, and money was flowing into our farmers, particularly through the agricultural policy, the Common Agricultural Policy. Social legislation, aided by the European Social Fund, rapidly was changing our society, generally speaking, I would say, for the better. And after 16 years, again, there was a change of government, and many of what were then seen as the best and the brightest were brought into our Parliament. And we even discovered around that time deficit budgeting, as Keynesian economics was being pursued. It was a time of optimism and growing confidence, a feeling almost of what could possibly go wrong. Well, far away something went very wrong, and that was the Arab-Israeli war. And for a while at tea time, children took the tops of their soft-boiled eggs to the soundtrack of the glamorous name of Moshe Dayan, who burst upon the consciousness of a generation. The war led to the first two world oil crises, which struck Ireland hard in the early 1980s. In the grip of the crisis, the government reacted again resolutely. They took strong action, necessary action that was right, but action that was at the time very unpopular. You will all remember the Frank Hall programmes, the Minister for Hardship, Richie Ruin, and all the rest of it. Some of you would remember it. A lot here won't and don't. But the economy survived, and it even grew again. But the government didn't. It was swept away in the most blatantly populist election the country had ever experienced, certainly up to that time. It was the unrealistic 1997 manifesto of Jack Lynch's Fianna Fáil government, a party determined to get back into power after they'd lost the election in 1973. The extravagant gifts and elaborate promises seduced the electorate and gave Fianna Fáil a huge overall majority in Dáil Éireann. It was a case of hello Jack and bye-bye Liam. Liam did the work, battling the recession, overcoming it, but at the same time, it was nice knowing you. That was the reaction of the Irish people then to that particular battled recession. Populist policies then took over in the late 70s. Bad management of the economy unleashed raging inflation, rising interest rates on homes and businesses across the country. The addiction to popularity and populism saw the government ignore doing what was right in favour of doing what was pleasing to the electorate. Again, a value judgment, and everyone can have their own opinions on the reality of what I've said there. And for that political pleasure, we settled into the pain and suffering of the protracted recession of the 1980s. And until the second half of that decade, a government reluctance, even phobic reluctance, to take the corrective action. Action was delayed very, very many years at that time, which led to a great prolongation of the recession that we suffered. And bear in mind, in that 80s recession, employment in Ireland went down to 1.1 million or 1.15 million of workers in Ireland, whereas in the depths of our recent recession, it didn't go below 1.85 million, to show you the relative severity of the 80s recession. But by the mid-90s, another recovery was well underway. Budget surpluses reappeared with productivity backing them, and so were living standards improving. However, lower personal and capital taxes did not deliver wage restraint in general. And after the year 2000, particularly inexorable increases in the public cost base eroded our competitiveness and undercut the strength of our economy. And social partnership, instead of controlling, tended to feed the appetite of the public spending monster. That was one of the interesting facts that emerged from that period. Productivity gains were replaced by a building boom that became a bust by 2008. In the period leading up to the elections in 2002, for instance, between 1 and 2, 25% was added to public spending, and another 25% was added in the run-up to the 2007 election. So you can see the extent to which the electoral cycle really blew the public finances, and all of that was depending on that building boom to last forever, to keep paying the bills that were created. The bills were of a long-term character, whereas the source of income then were of a very short-term nature. For the second time in 2 decades, the government, by commission and omission and addiction to populism, destroyed healthy growth and ultimately driving the economy into the cataclysmic collapse we have all experienced. For their part, and this we must, I think, be realistic and say the public backed these policies, election after election. If there was a lot done, there was always a lot more to do. But even with the shock of the fall, and this is the other very interesting thing, the patience and forbearance of the Irish population kicked in again. And now, 8 years later, we see the signs of a real recovery in our economy. Significant growth in employment, even spectacular growth in recent years in employment. Prospect of full employment by 2018. We see again the prospect of improving living standards and quality of services. And we see again that we are facing a crucial general election. So it's very interesting how things are coming around with similar sets of circumstances. Only this time, what will we do? That's what Joe wants to know. This time, will we look at our hard-won gains, look at our real recovery, look at the job situation in our families, in our community, and say, well, we will stick with that, or will we say we want more, and we want it now? So that is yet to be answered. Now, just another quick overview of our history, just to put a slightly different perspective on it. The management of our economy in the last 90 years, in accordance with the orthodoxies of the day. Initially, the orthodoxy was the Sinn Féin concept of protectionism, and that combined with Eamon de Valera's concept of a frugal and a God-fearing existence gave us that very protective, secluded society for a very long time. That had its uses in the 30s and particularly in the 40s with the Second World War. But we held on to it too long and too enthusiastically, and we missed the decade of the 50s virtually completely from the point of view of our capacity to open and grow our society and our economy. In the 60s, we embraced enthusiastically the new orthodoxy for us of Keynesian economics, but we employed the counter-cyclical strategy, which it is. We applied it very uncertainly. The theory, as you know, proposes borrowing and spending in recession to recover and reinvigorate the economy, but to replenish your resources by prudent policies when times were good. However, we tended to borrow and spend enthusiastically on all occasions, and that led us to long and difficult recessions. In the late 80s and the early 90s, we discovered another very useful orthodoxy in social partnership, and that played a key role in the planning and delivering of the Celtic Tiger period of recovery. However, for whatever reasons, it failed to take any actions to avert, or possibly didn't recognise, according to politicians we've said recently, nobody at that period recognised things that were happening at all. But never recognised the fatal flaws that had built into our public policy. And we took an enthusiasm, great enthusiasm was applied to concepts like benchmarking, and without seeing the potential flaws and where that was inevitably leading. Like protectionism, we should have loved social partnership for what it was, and loved it enough and understood it enough to let it go when times needed that approach. Only we didn't do that. So what does history teach us about ourselves? There are contradictory signs. It teaches, I think, that we are resourceful and entrepreneurial as a nation in building recoveries. If you look back over our history, Ireland has been spectacularly successful in very many ways. Politically, we keep our vengeance sharp, and particularly for the political leaders who manage us through recoveries, whether they're responsible for the recessions or not. That is definitely embedded in our tradition. It's also that we have an optimistic sense that the present recovery will last forever. During the Tiger years, we even began to talk about the Irish model, a new and buoyant economic life form which was impervious to gravity. And I didn't recognise that gravity existed in the world of economics at all. That was being talked about for a number of years. We have learned that at elections we develop a bit of a grow for the Pied Piper, or an ear for the siren song. And we always feel that no matter where we are now or what it is now, things can and should be a great deal better. In fact, our history tells us, by and large, that in many ways we do not learn from it. But perhaps it will be different this time. We are in a different era. Perhaps we've lost such a lot and had to suffer such a lot to regain such a lot will make us wary of the Pied Pipers on this occasion and deaf to the siren songs, and to think twice before we enter and open another door into the unknown. Now, I have a belief that representative parliamentary democracy, and this is traditional view, cannot function effectively without political parties. I just think the whole system cannot function and deliver government without political parties, and those political parties must have agreed policies which they put before the people and must have a system of implementing those policies, which is an effective whip system. I just take that as a given. Not everybody, as you can see from the political discourse in Ireland, agrees with that. And I think there are some elements in political thinking of the anarchist movements of the early decades of the 20th century in Europe, in some of that discourse. In 1948, we said, new political parties and lots of prominent independents. Now we have much more variety than that. We have movements, we have ventures, alliances, some with principles, without policies, lots of bells and whistles, mostly no whips, mostly no leaders, but dozens of potential leaders. There are also parties of the extreme left, the hard left, the social democratic left, and the green left. We are certainly very well represented in that era of politics. We have one new, fairly lonely-looking right-wing party, which is struggling to register significantly in the polls. We have flash mobs of independents gathering around any stray or passing issue, and sometimes any passing microphone or passing camera. How this can have anything to contribute to delivering the kind of stable and tested government Ireland now needs is hard to see. At least it's hard for me to see. Sometimes they make the Greek Syriza party, which was a very interesting element, look as organised as the German Christian Democratic Union. Culturally, things are different now. I know I'm under a bit of pressure time. Information has been democratised through social media, so you have instant politics, instant reactions. Small problems can become instant crises due to the fallibility of the absence of instant reaction, which is informed and right. Freedom of information has led to more open, more exposed and more vulnerable, but also more careful and cautious government. More information has not led, certainly in that arena, to better information. The old parties are under severe pressure, like 48. Then Fianna Fáil was holding solid, now Fine Gael is holding better, but the last chapter on that is certainly yet to be written. The public has not gathered around any single group of alternatives, nor anything coherent has yet been offered. The one old party, Sinn Féin, has become an important and enduring presence and a growing presence. And in a way it has, to use its own rhetoric, comparing it's almost like the Syriza of the North. And that play may have come unstuck as it struggles to define its political self to itself and to the public. Populist opposition or party of government, that's where they are. Conservative in Northern Ireland implementing Conservative Party policies, radical south of the border. And in many ways things remain the same. A small open economy, the western on the Atlantic coast. We are bound by European rules, which are not always necessarily a bad thing. But we do need a watertight ship, a savvy crew, the ability to chart a course in dangerous currents and unpredictable weather, and an ability to find a secure port for our country and our people. Government remains difficult, complex, and if good, unpopular. Every problem has a simple, straightforward, common sense answer which is always wrong. And these are the things. But if history guides us, it will indicate that we will start again or restart our little crush with the piper. But who and what will the piper be? Will it be a leader with a pawn shop for tweed and tweets who will play to us with a northern tune, will invite us to take a walk on the wild side while telling Europe and its money to bugger off? Or will the piper be one who urges us beyond the barricades to European and then world revolution? Though it spurns its erstwhile Anam Cora in Greece, the man who risked his political life to bring some security to his 11,000 citizens of his country. Or will we get, again, a musical voice drift over the lea offering us safety, security, prosperity without end or bound as of yore? Or just for once will we listen to the past, learn from our experiences, and stick with the people who have worked to rescue the country as it was? There is no absolute answer to this, only time will tell. The present government has a strong case to make. They have done noteworthy progress in the last 5 years. By no means getting everything right. That's an unnecessary thing to say. It is so obvious. But getting quite a lot right. Unemployment is under 10% for the first time since the height of the crisis. Investment is moving forward and up by over 14% last year. Government borrowing is falling markedly, down from the 22 billion high water mark in 11 to 5 billion euro last year. And the country is well on track to seeing the deficit go below the target of 3% of GDP this year. And that is, and they have achieved that much, so they have to make the case to the public that they can continue to do that work, have the heart, the energy, the enthusiasm and the vision to do it, while explaining to the people how that's the hard bit done and this is what the reward is going to be. This is what we are collectively going to do for the next period. Getting the country back on track may take more than one election, or getting the politics back onto a future track. I referenced the 4 elections in the 50s. In 18 months we had 3 elections in 81 and 82. In the late 80s we had 3 elections between 87 and 92. 3 elections in 6 years, 3 elections in 18 months, and 4 elections in 9 years. You could have that again now. There's absolutely, to settle down a future model which will go forward. I believe that the general election of 2016 will be the most important election in the first part of the 20th century. People will be deciding, do we want growth, do we want stability, do we want jobs, and do we want to stay with tried and tested pair of hands who have essentially got us to where we are. Now, not everyone agrees on the definition of what where we are is. Or do we want to go with change, live a bit on the wild side, go with some freshness and newness? And Joe wants us to look in the crystal ball. I don't think the polling data of recent times helps us in this yet. I don't think the Irish people are anywhere near making up their minds on that. That shows that none of the traditional parties have really grasped this, and there are no traditional groupings, and that vast, large amount of votes in the independents and others categories haven't gathered into any coherent form, and are not showing any signs of gathering into any coherent form. So I actually think myself that the state of knowledge and understanding now is such, and the fragility of our economy is such because of the burden of debt it is carrying. We can easily forget that. If there happened to be a sudden 2% increase in the bond rates we pay for money, our recovery was gone out the window, and our 3-4% of growth would just disappear in front of your eyes. So we are in a very fragile condition. And my guess is that this will be recognised and we will go for some level of security and safety in the future, however that might emerge. I think that the government can do it, provided they get the timing of the election right. And if they did something different than they've ever really done before, if they fought this election as in a government, taking the measure that they were elected as a government and given a big majority to do a job, they did it to the very best of their ability. And what they have delivered is what we have now. like the curate's egg, good and bad in spots, by no means perfect, but with great learning and stability. And if they fought the election as a government, fight it next spring, not as parties, they have a great chance of being re-elected as a government to continue and do that job. Because they could say that we have the unity, we have the stability, and look, where is your alternative? But if they fight the election in the traditional model and end up criticising, fighting one another, they lose a huge amount of what you might call that essential brand quality of stability, unity, security, and wisdom, and foresight and insight. So, will they do that? Chances are they won't. History is totally against that, because the parties end up trying to emphasise their difference more than their similarity, and forgetting the job they were asked to do by the public was together solve the problem. And I do believe there was a decision at the last election not to give Fine Gael an overall majority, because an awful lot of people did want another party, in that case the Labour Party, in with them, to give them the type of government they got. Now, Fine Gael and Labour, as people know, don't really like one another, even though they've been kind of like a bad marriage for 80 or 90 years. But that is, they are fated politically there. But they can work very well together, and together they can deliver very good results. And I think that's what they should do, and they have a very good chance. I think the parties of opposition have to ultimately try and find a way to put a credible proposition to the people, which will give us a bit of security and safety, so that all that we've achieved from the immense suffering that has gone by will not be just thrown away in another wild venture, and an uncertain venture. And we're not at a time in our history where we want to become a vast social experiment or a vast political experiment for some theoretical approach to politics. So that is it. What is going to happen? I most certainly do not know. I have a gut feel which I've explained to you. Will we go with the piper, or some piper, or will we go with the tried and tested? The question is, will we look back and learn, or will we go with our hopes of the future? We want it, and we want it now. It remains to be seen. Thank you very much.